Forget what you've seen in the glossy period dramas, the ones where the royal mistress sachets around in exquisite gowns, exchanging witty repartee with a smitten monarch. That's the historical equivalent of a marketing brochure for a haunted house. Pretty on the outside, but the inside is crawling with filth, disease, and the ghosts of desperate women. Tonight, we're ripping off that silken veil and getting down to the sweaty, thrumming, genuinely nauseating truth of what it meant to be a king's plaything, or, for that matter, any powerful man's property across history. It was less about stolen kisses and secret passion, more about a slow public disembowelment of your soul, often followed by a very literal end. If you think your ex was a user, wait until you hear about the historical titans who mastered the art of human exploitation with chilling, casual expertise. Let me know what shocked you most, because trust me, there's enough here to curdle milk and perhaps a few romantic illusions. We kick off in ancient Rome, a place overflowing with enough lust and depravity to make a modern-day influencer blush. Picture a Roman emperor, a man so powerful his every whim could literally mean life or death, not just for a person, but for entire cities. His sexual appetites, unchecked, often perverse, and always about power. Forget the notion of a tender, loving mistress. These were women and men who entered a game with no exit clause. They were property, plain and simple. Consider the plight of a Vestal virgin who dared to slip from her sacred oath. The Romans, those purveyors of so much civilization, didn't just execute her. Oh no, that would be too quick, too humane. Instead, they buried her alive, sealed in an underground chamber with a small lamp and a bit of bread and water, just enough to prolong the agony, to let the horror truly sink in as the air slowly ran out. This wasn't some isolated, barbaric act. It was a public spectacle, a chilling reminder of the state's absolute control over a woman's body and choices. Your choice, your shame, your slow, suffocating crawl towards death, all because you dared to throb for something other than divine duty. The message was clear. Your body was a tool for the state, or the gods, or the powerful, and deviation meant a very grim, very final consequence. This wasn't romance, it was a brutal social contract, enforced with every breath a woman took, or couldn't take. The women who became official mistresses of emperors or powerful senators weren't much luckier, though their deaths might be quicker. They were often showered with gifts, yes, but those gifts came with an invisible, suffocating collar. Their bodies, their reputations, their very existence became extensions of their patron status. Imagine being a high-born Roman woman, your family's honor tied to your purity, yet you're forced into a liaison with a man who could ruin them all with a whisper. Your every movement, every subtle moan, every public appearance was scrutinized. And when the emperor tired of you, when a new, fresher face caught his wandering eye, you were discarded like a broken amphora, sometimes sent to languish in forced exile, sometimes simply disappeared. Poison was a popular choice, clean and efficient, leaving little evidence beyond a sudden, painful illness. The history books rarely mention their names, their individual agonies lost to the grand narratives of imperial power. We remember Cleopatra for her cunning and power, but how many countless Roman women, equally clever, equally ambitious, were reduced to footnotes or simply erased from existence because their patron decided they no longer amused him? Their bodies were arenas for male power games, their souls often the first casualties. The veneer of lavish parties and golden trinkets barely concealed the constant, chilling hum of fear that accompanied every single day. A gilded cage is still a cage after all, and the bars were often forged from the very lust that put them there. The shame could be a death sentence long before the actual blade or poison vial appeared. Moving across the continent, let's talk about Bourbon, France, a place synonymous with powdered wigs, elaborate court rituals, and kings whose appetites were as gargantuan as their egos. Forget the romantic notion of Versailles. It was a gilded swamp, a hotbed of intrigue, disease, and profound psychological abuse. The king's official mistress, the maîtresse en titre, wasn't just a lover. She was a political institution, a lightning rod for court factions, and a walking, breathing risk assessment. Take Madame de Montespan, for example, the reigning favourite of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. She bore him 7 children, all legitimised and recognised. Sounds like power, right? Sounds like influence? Not quite. Her position was utterly dependent on the king's capricious affections, a precarious perch on the edge of a very high cliff. Every morning she woke up knowing her rival, Madame de Maintenon, was whispering in the king's ear, slowly chipping away at her standing. The court, a pit of vipers, watched her every move, waiting for her to stumble, and stumble she did, spectacularly. Montespan was implicated in the notorious affair of the poisons, a scandal that rocked France with accusations of black magic, assassinations, and illicit love potions. While she was never formally charged, her reputation was irrevocably smeared. The very air around her reeked of accusation. Louis XIV, ever the pragmatist when it came to his public image and private convenience, slowly distanced himself. Imagine the public humiliation, the slow withdrawal of favour, the cold stares from courtiers who just months before had fawned at her feet. She was not just a mistress, she was a breeding machine, a political tool, and ultimately a convenient scapegoat. The death sentence here wasn't a quick poison, but a lingering public shaming, a slow bleed of influence and dignity. She was exiled from court, forced to live out her days in religious seclusion, her once vibrant life reduced to a shadow, her body marked by years of royal use. The king moved on, of course, to Maintenon, who he eventually married in secret. The cycle continued, the next woman stepping into the same gilded cage, the same precarious dance with absolute power. The emotional consequences were devastating, the sense of exploitation palpable, and the memory of her public humiliation surely throbbed like an open wound until her very last breath. Her life became a cautionary tale, whispered through the lavish halls. Serve the king's lust, and you may find your very essence choked out of you. This pattern of women being used as bargaining chips, as instruments of state, or simply as outlets for male appetites, repeats across history with sickening regularity. Consider the concubines of the Ottoman harem, a world perhaps even more rigidly controlled than the French court. Forget the Orientalist fantasies of voluptuous women lounging around on silken cushions. The harem was a political machine, a gilded prison where thousands of women lived under constant surveillance, their lives utterly dictated by the whim of the sultan, and more terrifyingly, the valide sultan, the sultan's mother. These girls, often captured from foreign lands or sold into slavery, were meticulously trained. They learned music, dance, poetry, calligraphy, and, of course, the arts of physical pleasure. Their bodies were honed, their minds shaped, all for the singular purpose of catching the Sultan's eye, bearing him a son, and thus securing a future for themselves and, by extension, their families. It was a brutal competition. Imagine sharing a vast palace with hundreds, sometimes thousands of other women, all vying for the attention of one man. Every meal could be poisoned, every friendly gesture a betrayal. The eunuchs, castrated men who guarded the harem, were the ever-present enforcers, their grotesque presence a constant reminder of the physical and emotional mutilation that underscored this existence. If a concubine managed to bear a son, she became an Iqbal, a favored one, and her status rose. But if her son failed to become sultan, or if he was deemed a threat by another faction, she could be cast out, or worse. The infamous cage, a luxurious but isolated part of the palace, was where princes who were not heirs to the throne were kept in perpetual house arrest, often for decades, to prevent rebellions. Their mothers, if they survived, would find themselves similarly confined, their hopes and ambitions crushed. The ultimate death sentence in the harem wasn't always a blade, it was a burlap sack and a swift journey to the bottom of the Bosphorus, reserved for those who displeased the Sultan or posed a political threat. No questions asked, no bodies recovered. Just a ripple on the water and one less mouth to feed, one less potential problem. The cold, dark waters of the strait swallowed their screams, their desperation, their very identities. Their sexuality was their only commodity, and once it was spent, or deemed dangerous, their lives were deemed worthless. This wasn't romance, it was a terrifying game of human chess, where the pieces were made of flesh and blood, and the checkmate was often watery suffocation. The sheer dehumanization of it all, the reduction of vibrant women to mere reproductive and sexual vessels, is something that should make your stomach churn. They were beautiful flowers, cultivated meticulously, only to be trampled underfoot the moment their bloom faded or their scent became inconvenient. Their lives were a silent moan, echoing through marble halls. Let's shift our cynical gaze to medieval Europe, a time romanticized by tales of chivalry and courtly love. What a load of steaming manure! Beneath the veneer of knights in shining armor and damsels in distress lay a brutal reality for women, especially those of high birth. Marriage wasn't a choice, it was a transaction, a strategic alliance between powerful families, often sealed when the bride was barely past childhood. Her body became a political pawn, her hymen a property deed, and her womb a production line for heirs. The very concept of consent was as foreign as a hygiene regimen. And then there's the infamous, albeit historically debated, droit du seigneur, the right of the lord to sleep with a serf bride on her wedding night. Even if it wasn't a universally formalized law, the power dynamic it represented was very real. Imagine being a peasant girl betrothed to a man you might actually care for, only to have the hulking, often unwashed, lord of the manor assert his dominance, not just over your land, but over your most intimate moment. The shame, the violation, the absolute lack of recourse, her body, her burgeoning sexuality, was just another chattel on her lord's estate, subject to his whims. This wasn't courtly love, this was ritualized rape, a blunt assertion of power over the most vulnerable, the filth, the stench, the raw terror. And for noble women? While they might escape the immediate threat of droit du seigneur, their lives were often a different kind of trap. They were married off to older, often abusive men for political gain. Their primary duty was to produce male heirs. If they failed, their status plummeted. They could be cast aside, sent to a convent, or even subtly poisoned. A woman who couldn't bear a son was seen as a failure, a barren vessel, and her utility was gone. Her very existence became a testament to her inadequacy. The Church, for all its pronouncements on morality, often turned a blind eye to the rampant sexual exploitation within its own ranks or among the nobility, as long as it maintained social order and filled its coffers. Priests, often barely literate, preached purity while living lives of quiet, or not so quiet, debauchery. The constant risk of childbirth itself was a death sentence, with rudimentary medicine and rampant infection. Every pregnancy was a gamble with her life. Her body throbbed with the twin fears of failure and death, and if she survived, only to have her husband die, she might be forced into another marriage, often to a younger, more vigorous man, to continue the lineage, her aging body a mere tool. No wonder so many found solace, however fleeting, in illicit affairs, knowing full well the brutal penalties for discovery. The historical reality was a grim testament to the fact that women, regardless of status, were often just vessels, their bodies battlegrounds in the endless war for power and lineage. Their moans were often those of quiet desperation, not pleasure. Back to ancient Rome, but let's zoom in on the truly grotesque examples of imperial power, where sex wasn't just a byproduct of desire, but a deliberate weapon of psychological torment. Forget your romantic notions of toga parties. Think Caligula, Nero, Elagabalus, emperors whose names became synonymous with unbridled depravity and casual cruelty. These were men who viewed human beings as disposable playthings and women, especially, as mere orifices for their twisted appetites. Caligula famously, or infamously, was said to have slept with his 3 sisters and prostituted them to members of his court. This wasn't some consensual boundary-pushing kink. It was a brutal assertion of absolute power, a public humiliation designed to degrade both the women and the men forced to participate. Imagine the shame, the horror, the utter powerlessness of being forced to offer your body to a parade of leering, powerful men, all while your brother, the emperor, watched, perhaps with a smirk. Your dignity was systematically stripped away, piece by agonizing piece. The act itself was a violation, but the public nature of it, the forced performance, was the real torture. Your very essence was smeared with his filth. Nero, another charmer, was notorious for his forced marriages and his bizarre, elaborate sexual theatrics. He allegedly married a freedman named Sporus, having him castrated and dressing him as a woman. This wasn't just a quirky personal preference. It was a public spectacle, a deliberate blurring of lines, and a profound act of emasculation designed to cement his own power and defy all social norms. And then there's his alleged marriage to Pythagoras, another freedman, where Nero himself took the role of the bride. These weren't acts of love or even genuine lust. They were power plays designed to shock, dominate, and demonstrate his absolute, unfettered authority over bodies, gender, and societal expectations. The mistresses of such men, whether male or female, lived in a constant state of terror, every breath a gamble. One wrong glance, one perceived slight, and your life could be extinguished in a heartbeat. The threat of poison was ever present, a silent killer lurking in every cup. Or worse, the threat of public torture, of being paraded naked and humiliated before the ravenous Roman mob. Their lives were a constant throb of fear, their survival dependent on anticipating the next twisted whim of a madman. The very air around them reeked of impending doom, of blood and betrayal. These weren't romantic dalliances, they were high-stakes games where the loser paid with their life, or worse, their very soul. The screams were silent, but the horror was deafening. Now, let's fast-forward to Victorian England, a society dripping with prudish hypocrisy, where public morality was paramount and private depravity ran rampant. Beneath the rigid corsets and stern facades lay a vast, festering underworld of sexual exploitation. The fallen woman was a concept as common as smog, and just as suffocating. Imagine a young woman, perhaps from a poor family, with no prospects, no means of supporting herself. She might be seduced, or simply forced into prostitution to survive. Once she fell, she was utterly, irrevocably ruined in the eyes of society. There was no redemption, no path back. Her body became her only currency, slowly traded away in grimy back alleys and dimly lit brothels. The constant threat of disease, of violence, of public humiliation was her daily companion. Her life was a slow, agonizing crawl towards an early grave. Medical science of the era only added to the horror. Women suffering from anything from anxiety to a strong libido were often diagnosed with hysteria, a catch-all term for any female complaint that baffled male doctors. The treatment? Often the infamous pelvic massage performed by male physicians, a euphemism for what amounted to forced orgasm, justified as a medical necessity. The power dynamic here is sickeningly clear, men controlling and exploiting female bodies under the guise of care. The anatomical precision of the doctor's hands, devoid of consent or genuine concern was a brutal violation. And then there were the workhouses, those bleak, Dickensian hellholes, where the poorest of society were sent. For fallen women, these institutions were little more than prisons, designed to rehabilitate them through brutal labor and moral lectures. Many women were subjected to hymenal inspections, a degrading and invasive practice meant to determine their virginity or lack thereof, further stripping them of dignity and privacy. This wasn't just a medical procedure, it was a ritualistic shaming, a public declaration of their supposed moral failings. The constant surveillance, the public baths, the lack of personal space, all designed to break their spirit, to enforce conformity. The grim truth was, for many, the workhouse was a death sentence in slow motion, a place where malnutrition, disease, and despair gnawed at their very essence until nothing was left. The social pressure, the crushing poverty, the lack of options, these were the true architects of their demise. Their lives were a testament to the suffocating power of societal judgment, a constant smear of shame that followed them from cradle to grave. No king needed to personally sentence them. Society had already condemned them to a life of quiet desperation and eventual obliteration. The very air they breathed throbbed with their unacknowledged suffering. Now let's slither into Renaissance Italy, a period lauded for its art and philosophy, but also a cesspit of political intrigue, poison, and a particular brand of religious hypocrisy that would make a demon blush. And at the heart of it all, the Borgias. Forget the romanticized television series. The reality was far more chilling, far more visceral, and steeped in a raw, almost animalistic lust for power. Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, was not just a spiritual leader. He was a political mastermind with multiple mistresses and children, all while supposedly upholding the sanctity of the Church. His mistress, Vanozza de Catane, bore him 4 children, including the notorious Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia. These were not secret, whispered affairs. They were open secrets, scandalizing some, but openly embraced by others who saw the Church as just another political entity. The sheer audacity of it all, the casual disregard for religious vows, was a testament to the absolute power wielded by this family. Their wealth, their influence, their very existence was built on a foundation of moral decay. Lucrezia Borgia, his daughter, became the ultimate pawn in this perverse game of power. Married off 3 times, each union a calculated political maneuver, her body and her fertility were merely instruments to forge alliances. Her first marriage was annulled on dubious grounds of non-consummation, a blatant lie, simply because her family's political needs shifted. Imagine the shame, the public scrutiny, the implied questioning of her physical state. Her hymenal integrity was a matter of state, dissected and debated by cardinals. Her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, was brutally murdered by her brother Cesare's men when his usefulness expired. Imagine living with that knowledge, the constant threat of violence, the stench of blood always just beneath the surface of the lavish feasts. The official narrative would be a sudden illness, a tragic accident, but everyone at court knew the truth. He was choked out by the family's brutal ambition. Lucrezia herself was rumored to be involved in incestuous relationships with both her father and brother. While historical evidence is debated, the very fact that such rumors were rampant and widely believed speaks volumes about the moral climate. Her life was a constant throb of fear, a cycle of exploitation and abuse sanctioned by her own family and the Church. There was no escape, no true agency. Her very essence was reduced to a tool, her personal desires extinguished under the weight of her family's brutal agenda. Her marriages weren't unions of love, they were political annexations, and her survival was dependent on her silent compliance, her ability to embody the lust and power of her lineage. The ultimate death sentence was the spiritual one, her soul suffocated by the pervasive filth of her surroundings. Now let's pivot to the opulent yet chilling imperial courts of Asia, specifically focusing on China's Forbidden City. Here, the concept of a mistress was elevated to a rigid, bureaucratic system, a vast hierarchy of concubines, each meticulously ranked and utterly beholden to the emperor. Forget individual passion. This was about lineage, about power consolidation, and about satisfying the imperial libido in a highly ritualized, utterly dehumanizing way. Thousands of women resided within the Forbidden City, many never even seeing the emperor's face, let alone sharing his bed. They were selected, inspected, and then relegated to lives of exquisite boredom or intense, cutthroat competition. Their worth was tied solely to their ability to produce a male heir, especially one who would inherit the dragon throne. The bedroom protocol was a chilling example of this dehumanization. When a concubine was chosen for the night, she was stripped naked, wrapped in a blanket, and carried by eunuchs to the emperor's chambers, dumped unceremoniously at the foot of his bed. She wasn't allowed to speak unless spoken to, and her time with him was strictly limited, often with eunuchs waiting outside, ready to record the encounter and even dictate when it should end, to ensure no excessive exhaustion on the emperor's part and to prevent any lingering intimate conversation. Imagine the shame, the utter lack of dignity in this process. Your body, your sexuality, reduced to a transaction, a timed performance, stripped of any semblance of personal connection. And if you failed to produce a son, or worse, if you produced a daughter, your status plummeted. You could be forgotten, left to languish in a remote palace, your existence slowly fading into obscurity, a ghost among the living. The death sentence wasn't always immediate. It was often a slow, agonizing process of social obliteration, of being starved of attention, affection, and purpose. The struggle for power among the concubines was ruthless. Poison was common, accusations of witchcraft rampant. If a concubine's son was seen as a threat to the heir apparent, both she and her child could be summarily executed. The stories of concubines being tortured, starved, or even having their limbs removed for insubordination are not mere fables. They reflect a brutal reality where female bodies were merely extensions of imperial power. The moans of pleasure, if they existed, were drowned out by the constant hum of fear, the gnawing anxiety of being discarded, of being reduced to nothing. Their lives were a testament to ultimate submission, their bodies a stage for the emperor's absolute dominance. The silence of the Forbidden City often throbbed with unspoken terror, the stench of forgotten dreams lingering in its ancient walls. Let's talk about the ultimate price. What happened when the powerful grew tired, when political winds shifted, or when a mistress simply outlived her usefulness? The death sentence for a royal mistress, or any woman serving a man in power through her body, often wasn't a dramatic, cinematic affair. More often, it was a quiet, suffocating disappearance. Imagine Madame du Barry, the final official mistress of Louis XV of France. Her story, for a time, was one of triumph, a woman from humble origins rising to the pinnacle of power and luxury. She was showered with jewels, estates, and unprecedented influence. But her reign was short-lived, dependent entirely on the king's fading affections and his eventual death. When Louis XV died, the new king, Louis XVI, and particularly his young, imperious queen, Marie Antoinette, despised her. Du Barry was immediately exiled from court, banished to her estate. This wasn't just a change of address, it was a complete severance from the source of her power, her identity, her very reason for existence within that world. The social humiliation was immense, her public life abruptly choked off. But her story takes a darker turn during the French Revolution. Despite her initial loyalty to the monarchy and her attempts to aid the royal family, her past association with the extravagant, hated old regime made her a target. She foolishly returned to France from England to recover stolen jewels. This act of self-interest sealed her fate. She was arrested, tried by the Revolutionary Tribunal, and condemned for treason. The once glorious mistress who had commanded the attention of a king found herself on a tumbril, carted through the filthy streets of Paris to the guillotine. Her final moments were not stoic. She reportedly pleaded, begged, and screamed for mercy, her terror palpable. Her beauty, her charm, her power, all counted for nothing against the revolutionary fervor. Her throat was brutally severed, her body dumped unceremoniously into a mass grave. Her life, once a dazzling display of opulence and sexual power, ended in a grotesque public display of vengeance, a brutal, final repayment for her privileged past. The throb of the blade, the smear of blood. These were the ultimate payoffs for playing the king's game. Then there were the more insidious ends. Some were simply relegated to convents, forced to take vows, their once vibrant lives shuttered behind stone walls, their sexuality extinguished by religious piety. This wasn't a choice, it was a banishment, a prison cloaked in sanctity. The emotional toll of such a fate, stripped of freedom, intimacy, and purpose, was a slow death of the spirit. Others faced quiet poisonings, a convenient illness that swept them away without scandal, allowing the powerful to move on seamlessly to their next conquest. These accidental deaths were whispers in the court, never proven, always suspected. Their memory was swiftly erased, their very existence rendered irrelevant. Their blood was never spilled publicly, but their lives were just as effectively drained away. The bleak reflection here is that these women, regardless of their cunning or ambition, were ultimately disposable. Their bodies, once objects of desire and tools for power, became burdens, quickly discarded when no longer useful. No grand heroics, no noble sacrifice, just the chilling, cyclical reality of lust, power, and often an ignominious end. The moans, the sweat, the shame, it all accumulated, festering until it suffocated their very breath. So, here we are, after crawling through the filth and throb of history's sexual power plays. We've seen how the so-called glamour of being a royal mistress, a concubine, or even a medieval noblewoman was often a thinly veiled death sentence. It wasn't about love, it was about utility, about lineage, about property. These women were commodities, their bodies and their wombs merely tools in a patriarchal game of thrones, with the stakes being their dignity, their freedom, and often their very lives. From the Vestal virgins buried alive for a misplaced throb of lust, to the concubines drowned in the Bosphorus for a perceived slight, to the French mistresses dragged to the guillotine for simply existing in the wrong era, the pattern is sickeningly consistent. The shame, the exploitation, the public exposure, the intimacy as control, these weren't footnotes in history, but the agonizing realities that defined countless female lives. There were no hero arcs here, no soaring triumphs of love over adversity, only cycles of lust, power, and brutal, often quiet, punishment. The most disturbing part, the core dynamics haven't fundamentally changed, only the packaging. We still live in a world where power, wealth, and status often dictate sexual access and control. The whispers of "Down Me Too," the revelations of powerful men exploiting vulnerable women, it's just the modern iteration of the same ancient, festering disease. We might not have royal concubine systems or public guillotine executions for discarded lovers, but the insidious power games, the psychological manipulation, the professional and social ostracism for those who speak out or displease the powerful are still very much alive. The modern mistress or plaything of a powerful man might not face a literal death sentence, but her career, her reputation, her mental well-being can be just as effectively choked off, her voice silenced, her future smeared with the scandal of association. The raw, guttural struggle for agency, the fight against being reduced to a mere body, continues. The lessons from history aren't just quaint stories of bygone eras, they are stark warnings that the human appetite for dominance, particularly sexual dominance, is an unending hunger, and the cost for those caught in its maw remains devastatingly high. So next time you see a period drama, remember the stench beneath the perfume, the blood beneath the silk, and the silent screams echoing through the grand halls. History has a perverse sense of humor, doesn't it? And sometimes the punchline is just a brutal, bleak reflection of ourselves.